October 25, 1944, 6:30 off Samar. Philippines. The sun broke over a sea boiling with smoke trails and burning oil slicks. Japanese survivors clung to debris, watching U.S. carrier planes wheel overhead. By nightfall, 10 of their warships would be gone. The Japanese committed 67 major warships to what they called Operation Shō-1. Only a fraction would return. October 1944. In Tokyo, Admiral Toyoda Soemu issued the order for what would be the Imperial Navy's last great gamble. Operation Shō-1 called for 3 separate forces to converge on the U.S. invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. To the Americans, it would later seem like madness, throwing battleships, cruisers, and carriers into a gauntlet they could not survive. But for Toyota, it was the final chance to halt the advance that had carried the U.S. Navy from Guadalcanal to the very doorstep of the Philippines. The most curious piece of the plan was Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force. On paper, it looked like the strike arm of old, the veteran fleet carrier Zuikaku, survivor of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, and 3 light carriers, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zueho. In reality, their hangars were nearly bare. Between them, they carried barely 108 to 116 aircraft, less than a single well-stocked American carrier air group. Many were obsolete or flown by half-trained pilots. Ozawa knew the truth. His carriers were bait. The contrast with their opponent was brutal. To the south, Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet prowled the Philippine Sea. Task Force 38, the striking arm, was a juggernaut. Depending on the day's rotation of groups, it could field 14 to 17 fast carriers, deckloads of nearly 1,000 to 1,100 Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers. U.S. hangar decks bristled with activity. Planes lined up in neat rows, engines coughing as ordnance crews armed them for sortie after sortie. Compared to this, Ozawa's decks looked like empty stages after a performance had ended. The irony was sharp. Japan, the nation that had pioneered carrier warfare at Pearl Harbor, was now deploying carriers with barely enough planes to fill their elevators. Toyota's orders, later summarized in staff notes, were clear enough. The carriers were to draw Halsey north, intensing him to chase airpower, while Kurita's battleships and cruisers slipped into Leyte Gulf to smash the invasion transports. The decisive battle that Japan had prepared for since the 1930s would finally unfold. In Toyota's mind, even the sacrifice of carriers was acceptable if it meant landing a mortal blow on America's fleet. Not everyone believed. Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, a staff officer who had flown with the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, later wrote of his doubts. He knew the carriers had little to give, and that sending them into the teeth of U.S. airpower meant near certain death. His memoirs carried the restrained bitterness of an aviator who had watched Japan squander its last trump card. On the flight decks of Zuikaku and Zueho, young sailors understood as much. Whispered conversations spread at night. "We're being sent to die, aren't we?" The proud carrier that had once launched aircraft at Oahu now carried fewer than 30 serviceable planes. The irony weighed heavily. They had begun the war by striking first from the air. Now they would end it as decoys, targets meant only to buy time. Across the horizon, American intelligence officers had picked up signs of a northern force. Their reports noted the possibility of a diversionary carrier group, but assessments underestimated just how thoroughly Japan had hollowed out its once feared strike arm. To Halsey and his staff, any Japanese carrier still afloat demanded attention. They did not yet realize that Ozawa's decks were mostly theater, hulls without claw. The trap had been set. The stage was wide. Nearly 300 miles of ocean separated the decoys from the real killers, Kurita's battleships steaming in from the west. The men on Ozawa's flight decks waited, knowing they were not expected to win. Their task was to be seen, to draw fire, to vanish so that others might strike. It was a duty as old as war itself, but bitter for those who had once carried Japan's banner of victory. Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. Signal sent, October 25. The message cut across radio circuits like a thunderclap. Admiral Chester Nimitz' headquarters in Hawaii had sent a routine query to Admiral William Halsey, asking the location of his battleships. A staff officer in Pearl Harbor had added a flourish. The world wonders, a poetic padding meant to obscure the message from codebreakers. When Halsey read it, stripped of context, it struck like an accusation. The admiral, charging north in pursuit of Japanese carriers, bristled with fury. While he steamed after Ozawa's decoys, a far more dangerous force was breaking through from the west. That western threat was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. It was the heart of Operation Shō-1, the behemoth battleships Yamato and Musashi, supported by Nagato and a screen of heavy cruisers and destroyers. The force represented much of what remained of Japan's surface power. Their mission was simple and desperate: push through the Sibuyan Sea, reach Leyte Gulf, and annihilate the American invasion fleet. On October 24, 1944, Kurita's ships were discovered. Task Force 38 strike groups launched wave after wave from Essex-class carriers. In total, about 259 sorties roared in against the column of gray steel plowing eastward. The U.S. Navy had perfected the choreography of massed carrier aviation, Hellcat fighters diving to strafe flak positions, Helldivers rolling into steep bomb runs, Avengers slanting in with torpedoes. The main target was Musashi. The ship was one of the largest battleships ever built, bristling with 9 18.1-inch guns and armored with up to 16 inches of steel. Her captain, Toshihira Inaguchi, believed in leading from the bridge even under fire. When the first squadrons arrived around midday, anti-aircraft batteries filled the sky with black bursts, yet coordination failed. Without fighter cover of their own, Musashi and her escorts were naked beneath the precision of American attack patterns. Bombs tore into her decks. Torpedoes struck with thunderous concussions, lifting the massive hull sideways. Reports compiled afterward estimated Musashi suffered 19 torpedo and 17 bomb hits, a figure debated, but enough to seal her fate. Survivors later recalled the eerie sight of water flooding across steel corridors while lights flickered. One remembered wading waist-deep in oil as he struggled to climb ladders toward the open air. Captain Inaguchi chose to remain aboard as his ship faltered. By late afternoon, Musashi was wallowing, down by the bow, still firing, but hopelessly crippled. Around 7:30 p.m., she rolled over and slipped beneath the Sibuyan Sea, taking more than 1,000 men with her. Roughly 1,300 were plucked from the water by destroyers. As the great battleship turned turtle, survivors heard voices rise in the national anthem Kimigayo, a last affirmation of loyalty as the sea swallowed them. The irony was brutal. Musashi had been designed to crush enemy fleets in the decisive gunnery battle Japanese doctrine envisioned. Instead, she never fired a shot at Leyte's beaches. Air power, not armor, had determined the outcome. Kurita himself was shaken. He had already survived a U.S. submarine ambush 2 days earlier that sank 2 of his cruisers. Now his flagship column had lost its most powerful vessel. In post-war testimony, he admitted, "I felt I must go on, even though I had lost heart." Still, he rallied his fleet, turned back toward the San Bernardino Strait, and prepared to press on. Meanwhile, the American dilemma deepened. Halsey was chasing Ozawa's empty carriers to the north, his fast battleships racing with him. No heavy U.S. surface force barred Kurita's path. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's staff asked the fatal question. Where is Task Force 34, the garbled edition? The world wonders, cut like mockery. In reality, orders were ambiguous. Halsey believed protecting the landing beaches fell to Admiral Kincaid's 7th Fleet, while his own mandate was to destroy enemy carriers. The misalignment of assumptions would nearly undo the American position. For Kurita, battered yet unbroken, the way to Leyte was still open. The loss of Musashi had not ended the threat. It had only set the stage for an even bloodier confrontation. 7 o'clock, October 25. Shells from Yamato straddled tiny U.S. escort carriers. Dawn revealed a nightmare. Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy, Sprague's task unit April 3, 77, better known as Taffy 3, was supposed to provide close air support for the U.S. landings at Leyte. His 6 escort carriers were slow, thin-skinned, and lightly armed. Their job was to launch anti-submarine patrols and bombing runs against beachheads, not fight battleships. Yet on this morning they found themselves face-to-face with Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and a host of heavy cruisers and destroyers, all steaming east with their guns trained on Sprague's tiny flat tops. Shell splashes rose higher than the carriers themselves. The sea around Fanshawe Bay erupted as 18-inch shells from Yamato bracketed her position. Sprague later wrote that he expected annihilation within minutes. His only order was the obvious one: open fire and run like hell. The carriers turned due east, raising spray as they fled at 17 knots, their maximum speed. It was like trying to outrun greyhounds with lame mules. What followed was one of the most lopsided and heroic clashes in naval history. Gambier Bay, Kalinin Bay, and Fanshawe Bay launched every aircraft they had, regardless of ordnance. Pilots took off with half-loaded fuel tanks, depth charges meant for submarines, even machine guns alone. Anything was better than leaving the decks full. These aircraft harried the Japanese columns, diving and strafing, forcing battleships to weave and cruisers to break formation. The real shield, however, was Sprague's small screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts. Johnston, under SCMD WW, Ernest Evans, charged first. Heavily outgunned, Evans ordered a torpedo run straight at the Japanese heavy cruisers. Shells ripped into his ship. One destroyed the bridge, leaving him shouting orders from an open deck. Still, he pressed in, launching a spread of torpedoes that forced Kurita's flagship Yamato to turn away. It was an almost suicidal gesture, and it bought the carriers precious time. Survivor oral histories remember Johnston charging through smoke, guns blazing. A sailor recalled hearing Evans yell, "All engines ahead, flank!" a line later paraphrased in his Medal of Honor citation. Howell and Samuel B. Roberts followed suit, making torpedo attacks of their own. The Little Roberts, nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, closed to within 4,000 yards of Japanese cruisers before being blasted apart. Amid the smoke and confusion, irony reigned. These were not fleet carriers with armored decks and massive air groups. Each CVE carried around 28 planes. Half-trained pilots, maintenance crews, still green. Yet these very ships, never meant for surface combat, managed to blunt a fleet that included the largest battleship in the world. The Japanese should have crushed them, but hesitation and disarray crept into Kurita's force. His logs later noted, unexpectedly heavy air attack from small carriers. To the admiral and his staff, it looked as though they had stumbled into a major carrier group, not auxiliaries. American pilots pressed the illusion, reporting multiple flat tops engaging them, when in truth they were all of the same fragile type. The cost to Taffy 3 was staggering. Gambier Bay took direct hits from heavy cruiser shells and became the only U.S. carrier in the war sunk by naval gunfire. Johnston, riddled with shell fire, fought until her guns ran silent, then sank beneath the waves. Howell and Samuel B. Roberts followed. By day's end, roughly 1,500 American sailors were dead or clinging to rafts in oil-slick seas. Yet the damage inflicted on Kurita was equally serious. Chikuma and Chokai were hammered by carrier planes and destroyer torpedoes, both eventually sinking. Suzuya was set ablaze by bomb hits and exploded when her torpedoes detonated. Kumano was badly damaged, forced to limp away. The center force had lost its cohesion and much of its striking power. Ensign Thomas Leonard, a pilot from Kalinin Bay, remembered ditching his Avenger near the burning wreck of Gambier Bay. In his oral history he described swimming amid floating debris while Japanese shells still fell into the water around him. He feared being machine-gunned by aircraft, but instead he was picked up hours later by a U.S. destroyer escort. The psychological weight of the battle was immense. On the American side, destroyer crews knowingly sacrificed themselves to protect their carriers, an act of defiance that became legendary. Sprague later said his men fought like lions. For the Japanese, the sudden eruption of defiance from what should have been helpless escort carriers sowed doubt. Kurita, already shaken by the loss of Musashi, now hesitated. He had broken through the San Bernardino Strait as planned, but at the critical moment he turned back, convinced he was facing a larger force than his orders anticipated. The myth later took hold that Yamato's main guns never fired effectively in the battle. In truth, the giant battleship loosed multiple salvos, including at least 2 bracketing Gambier Bay. But gunnery in rain squalls, smoke, and constant air attack proved far less decisive than doctrine had promised. The decisive battle had arrived, and air power, not naval artillery, was dictating its terms. As the morning ended, wreckage and oil fires covered the sea east of Samar. Survivors of Taffy III clung to rafts, watching their ships disappear. Japanese sailors abandoned cruisers and destroyers under attack from aircraft they could scarcely see. The U.S. Navy had paid dearly, but Kurita's force, the supposed hammer meant to smash the Leyte landings, was already withdrawing. What began at 7:00 with Yamato's shells straggling fragile carriers ended hours later in one of the greatest upsets in naval warfare. Tiny ships, half-armed planes, and sheer will had stopped a fleet designed for decisive victory. The irony could not have been sharper. The largest battleship afloat had been turned back by the smallest carriers in the war. By noon, the Philippine sky buzzed with hundreds of engines, the roar drowning even gunfire. The morning chaos off Samar was only the beginning. As Kurita's retreating force tried to escape eastward, Task Force 38 unleashed its full weight. Carriers Essex, Lexington, Enterprise, and their sisters launched strike after strike. By the end of October 25, roughly 527 sorties had thundered into the skies, above the Sibuyan Sea, Leyte Gulf, and Cape Engano. To American pilots it felt like hunting season. To Japanese sailors it was execution by air power. Commander Air Group David McCampbell, the Navy's top Hellcat ace, led fighter sweeps that cleared away the few Japanese aircraft still able to contest the skies. McCampbell's earlier exploits at the Marianas Turkey Shoot had made him famous, but here the resistance was almost negligible. Japanese anti-aircraft fire rattled and spat, but coordination was weak and ammunition short. Hell divers rolled into their dives with near impunity. Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell flew Avengers against cruisers struggling to maintain formation. He later recalled strafing lifeboats and abandoning ships, a grim task he justified as part of the mission. Yet he also remembered fellow pilots dropping rafts and supplies to Japanese survivors, defying strict orders to prioritize attack runs. The results were devastating. The heavy cruiser Chikuma, already battered by Taffy III's planes, was hounded by Avengers until torpedoes finished her. Chokai, a key heavy cruiser in his force, was crippled and abandoned. Suzuya caught bombs that detonated her own torpedoes, producing a chain of explosions that tore the ship apart. Kumano staggered away with her bow shattered, crippled but afloat. From Kurita's vantage point, the sight was unbearable. Survivors remembered him standing silently on the bridge, watching fire consume one cruiser after another. The force he had led through the San Bernardino Strait the night before was dissolving in plumes of smoke and geysers of spray. He had gambled on breaking into Leyte Gulf, but his fleet was being dismantled piece by piece by men he could not even see. American strike reports, compiled afterward, brimmed with overclaims. Pilots in the heat of battle believed they had sunk more ships than the record later confirmed. It was a familiar pattern in carrier warfare, multiple squadrons attacking the same target, each convinced of its kill. Post-war assessments trimmed the lists, leaving a hard core of losses. Chikuma, Chokai, Suzuya gone, Kumano maimed. But even pared back, the results were catastrophic for Japan. The contrast could not have been sharper. Japanese doctrine had once centered on the power of big guns, the decisive clash of battleships. Here, those guns were firing, but blind and ineffectual. Escort carriers, destroyers, and now the massed air wings of the fast carriers had dictated the battle's course. Precision dive bombing and torpedo runs from hundreds of planes accomplished what 18-inch shells could not. The irony was bitter. Japan's decisive battle fleet, built around ships that dwarfed anything afloat in 1941, was being undone by aircraft launched from hundreds of miles away. Armor and size no longer guaranteed survival. Survivors drifting in the water later admitted that they had felt like targets in a live fire exercise. The myth grew in later retellings that the Americans had flown over 1,000 sorties in a single day. The reality was still immense but more precise. Approximately 527 sorties, for TF-38 tabulation, were launched on October 25, part of a 3-day total of about 80 U.S. planes lost in combat and accidents. The scale was overwhelming without needing exaggeration. Buell's memory of strafing and mercy captured the duality of the day. American pilots had been trained to strike until the target sank. Yet they were still human beings, seeing enemies clinging to wreckage. Some dropped life rafts even as others emptied machine guns into lifeboats. It was not clean, not heroic in the old sense of battleship duels. It was modern war, brutal and conflicted. For Japanese officers, the psychological turn was inescapable. They had long argued that air power could not by itself destroy the decisive fleet. Watching cruisers vanish beneath waves and hearing the ceaseless drone of American engines above, many conceded in silence that the age of surface supremacy was gone. The fleet built for Kantai-Kessen had met its decisive battle, but on American terms, from the sky. By dusk, the Sibuyan Sea and Philippine waters were littered with burning hulks and oil slicks. Survivors floated in silence, waiting for rescue or death. Above them, American carriers recovered aircraft with clockwork efficiency, ready to launch again at dawn. The balance of power had shifted beyond recall. My carriers died gloriously, though uselessly. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, Post-War Reflection. At Cape Enganu on October 25, 1944, the final act of Japan's carrier arm unfolded. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded what looked on paper like a formidable task force, the fleet carrier Zuikaku and the light carriers Zuioho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. But the reality was far different. Between them, the four carriers carried barely 100 aircraft. Most were outdated, flown by pilots who lacked training hours. Their decks were nearly barren, a shadow of the great strike force that had once darkened Pearl Harbor. Against them came Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 38. By mid-morning, he launched over 300 aircraft in successive waves. Hellcats escorted Helldivers and Avengers as they roared toward the northern horizon. Flight decks on Essex and Lexington churned with motion. Every few minutes, another squadron rolled down the deck into the sky. The contrast could not have been sharper. U.S. carriers straining under the weight of abundance. Japanese carriers scraping together what they could to look threatening. Ozawa knew the truth of his role. He had been assigned as decoy, ordered to lure Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the Leyte beaches. If sacrifice was required, then so be it. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, his air staff officer, recorded the quiet resignation with which Ozawa gave the order to sail into battle, knowing they had little to strike back with. The attacks came relentlessly. By late morning, Zuikaku was struck by multiple bombs and torpedoes. Flames roared through her hangar decks. The ship that had once launched aircraft against Oahu and Midway now burned under American attack squadrons. At 14:14, Zuikaku began to list heavily. Survivors remembered crewmen mustering on the flight deck, saluting the rising sun flag and chanting "Banzai" 3 times before she rolled and slipped beneath the sea. She was the last surviving fleet carrier from the Pearl Harbor strike force, an end heavy with symbolism. The others soon followed. Zueho was battered and left burning, capsizing in the afternoon. Chitose was sunk by torpedo hits, vanishing quickly. Chiyoda lingered until evening, pummeled by bombs and shells, finally finished off by U.S. cruisers' gunfire. In the span of a single day, Japan lost 4 carriers, over 1,500 men, and the last vestige of its once proud Kido Butai. American pilots' strike reports reflected the chaos of the engagement. Some squadrons claimed more carriers destroyed than actually went down, a reminder of the fog of war and the eagerness to record kills. Post-war analysis trimmed the tallies, but the essentials remained. All 4 carriers eliminated, air groups wiped out. The irony was complete. Ozawa's carriers had almost no planes to offer. Yet by sailing north and broadcasting their presence, they achieved their purpose. Halsey, convinced the carrier force was still a major threat, had taken his battleships north, leaving the San Bernardino Strait uncovered. The decoy had perished, but it had drawn American attention away at the critical hour. Still, for Japan, the cost was terminal. The carrier arm that had defined its early victories no longer existed. Zuikaku's sinking symbolized the death of the doctrine that had begun the Pacific War. Among American sailors, there was no gloating. Men who watched from U.S. destroyers or picked survivors from the sea later admitted a measure of respect. The sight of Zuikaku's crew saluting as they went down left an impression even on those who had fought them since 1941. In the aftermath, some U.S. veterans remarked that the Japanese carriers had died with dignity, even if their mission had been futile. For Ozawa, it was resignation, not triumph. In his post-war words, the sacrifice had been glorious, though useless. His ships had lured Halsey, but the strategic tide could not be reversed. The carriers were gone, and with them the last illusion of Japanese sea power. By 2000, October 25th, 10 major Japanese warships had been sunk, counting Fuso's breakup and Mogami's evening scuttling. U.S. Naval Summary. The day's ledger was written in fire and steel. Across 3 separate battles, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been torn apart. Off Cape Engano to the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's decoy carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda all went down. Off Samar, Kurita's center force lost heavy cruisers Chikuma, Chokai, and Suzua as it staggered away under relentless air attack. And in the night waters of Surigao Strait, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force was annihilated. The battleships Yamashiro and Fuso and the heavy cruiser Mogami were sunk under the guns and torpedoes of the U.S. 7th Fleet. It was the most complete destruction of a Japanese fleet in a single day of the war. Surigao Strait in particular carried a cruel symmetry. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded an American battle line of 6 old battleships: West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. All had been at Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. Now they waited at the mouth of the strait, joined by cruisers, destroyers, and radar-scented gunfire. When Nishimura's column advanced in the darkness, it was caught in a crossfire of torpedoes and radar-scented gunfire. Yamashiro went down under a storm of shells. Fuso exploded and broke in 2, and Mogami was battered until scuttled the following day. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor had returned for vengeance, firing the shots that ended Japan's last attempt to break into Leyte Gulf. The statistics tell the scope. Between October 23 and 26, Japan lost roughly 306,000 tons of warships. In the same span, American losses included 1 light carrier, Princeton, 2 escort carriers, Gambier Bay and St. Lo, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. Nearly 3,000 American sailors were dead, but the strategic balance was decisive. Japan had sacrificed the last of its carrier fleet, 2 battleships, and 6 heavy cruisers in 4 days. Navy communiques released afterward painted the victory in broad strokes, often repeating inflated pilot claims. Strike reports credited sinkings that post-war tallies reduced. The fog of war had exaggerated the scale, but the essence remained clear. In one operation, the Imperial Navy had been broken beyond repair. The contrast with Japan's pre-war doctrine could not have been starker. For decades, the Imperial Navy had prepared for Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet action where massive battleships and long-range torpedoes would decide supremacy. Instead, its forces had been shredded in fragments, one group at Surigao, another off Samar, a third at Cape Engano. There had been no single duel of equals. There had only been piecemeal destruction at the hands of a U.S. fleet that mastered coordination and air power. The irony was bitter. The decisive battle Japan had sought came at Leyte, but not as planned. Rather than one great clash, it became a series of disasters. Instead of breaking the U.S. invasion fleet, the Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a strategic weapon. Historians later called Leyte Gulf the largest naval battle in history. The title is not simple. If measured by ships engaged, Midway and Jutland were smaller. But Leyte spanned 4 separate actions across hundreds of miles, involving hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft. By tonnage sunk, it stands as the greatest defeat of a modern fleet. Still, the myth requires caution. The phrase "largest battle ever" simplifies a complex operation into a slogan. In the aftermath, American destroyers and destroyer escorts swept the waters for survivors. One U.S. sailor later remembered pulling exhausted Japanese men from the sea. Their uniforms were charred, their eyes hollow. Cigarettes were offered. In silence, enemies shared them. For a brief moment, mercy replaced fire. For Japanese survivors, the realization was crushing. 10 ships gone in a single day, more across the 4-day battle, and nothing left to replace them. The fleet that had sailed proudly from Linga roads was scattered wreckage and oil slicks. Those who lived through it understood what headquarters could not yet admit. The Imperial Navy was finished. In Manila hospitals, the smell of burnt flesh mingled with boiled rice for the wounded. The survivors of Leyte Gulf trickled back not as victors but as fragments of a shattered navy. Destroyers and auxiliaries limped into Manila Bay, carrying men pulled from the Sibuyan Sea, Samar, and Cape Engano. Their bandages were soaked through, their eyes glazed. Some had been in the water for hours, others for days. The once proud sailors of the Imperial Navy shuffled into makeshift wards, where the odor of antiseptic mixed uneasily with the familiar scent of rice boiling for the daily ration. Captain Tameichi Hara, a destroyer commander who had fought since the beginning of the war, visited wards where men lay silent, staring at the ceiling. He later wrote that what haunted him most was not their wounds, but their emptiness. They had set out for Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle, and instead returned from a massacre. The numbers were staggering. Across 4 days of battle, roughly 10,000 Japanese sailors had perished. About 1,500 survivors were rescued from ships like Musashi and Zuikaku alone, plucked from seas heavy with oil and corpses. Exact figures varied. Some wartime communiques inflated losses, some memoirs understated them, but the reality was clear enough. Japan had gambled its fleet and lost it. In staff meetings, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who had once crafted carrier strategy, struggled to find words. Reports listed 10 ships sunk on October 25 alone, a figure that left officers in stunned silence. For decades they had trained to deliver a decisive blow. Now they faced the truth that their navy could no longer even defend its homeland. American hospitals told another story. Survivors fished from the water by U.S. destroyers were processed as prisoners of war. On hospital ships, Japanese sailors were cleaned, treated, and fed. Many expected beatings. Instead, they were given rations. One sailor later recalled his first taste of canned peaches, sweet, alien, and unforgettable. The irony was bitter. Men who had trained to destroy the American enemy now lived because of American food and medicine. U.S. Navy nurses and corpsmen treated wounds without question of nationality. A few POWs expressed gratitude, bowing awkwardly in their beds. One American destroyer crewman remembered handing out cigarettes to survivors hauled aboard. "We'd been trying to kill each other that morning. Now we smoked together on the deck." In small, unrecorded acts, humanity survived amid ruin. Admiral Raymond Spruance, reflecting after the war, remarked that Leyte Gulf had not been one battle but 4 collisions of fleets. What struck him was not just the tactical result, but the psychological one. Japan had thrown in everything it had left, and it had not been enough. The contrast was glaring. On USS ships, sailors enjoyed steady meals, eggs, meat, even ice cream when machines worked. Japanese survivors in Manila shared rice thinned with barley, broth with almost no meat, and scarce vegetables. The abundance of one navy and the deprivation of the other mirrored the broader war effort. The Allies' industrial tide was unstoppable. Japan was drowning in scarcity. Casualty numbers circulated in Tokyo and Washington, sometimes exaggerated for morale. Post-war historians trimmed them, but whether 9,700 or 10,500 Japanese dead, whether 2,800 or 3,000 Americans, the magnitude was enough to mark Leyte as the grave of the Imperial Navy. Myth-making could not obscure the reality etched in loss. Anecdotes from survivors captured the emotional turn. A sailor from Zuikaku remembered the deck tilting under his feet, the chants of banzai as the carrier rolled, and the silence of the sea afterward. In Manila, when he was handed a tin of peaches by a U.S. nurse, he wept. He no longer spoke of the emperor or the decisive battle. He only spoke of hunger, of survival, and of shame. The psychological shift was slow but unmistakable. Devotion to the emperor, once unshakable, gave way to quiet acceptance. They had been told their sacrifice would change the war. Now, with 10 ships gone in a single day and more lost across the Gulf, the survivors knew it had not. For them, Leyte Gulf was not a battle. It was the moment they realized the fleet was finished. By war's end, only 4 Japanese carriers remained afloat, none combat-ready. The destruction at Leyte Gulf marked more than the loss of ships. It marked the death of an idea. The doctrine of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet battle envisioned by Admiral Yamato Izoroku, had driven Japanese naval strategy for decades. Yamamoto had believed in concentrating power for one crushing strike, but even he had understood the rising importance of aviation. Ironically, the doctrine he shaped collapsed only 3 years after his death, when his fleet was annihilated not by battleships in a line of battle, but by swarms of American aircraft. For the United States, Leyte confirmed dominance. Admiral Chester Nimitz watched as the Essex-class program rolled on, ship after ship leaving American shipyards. By 1945, 17 Essex-class carriers were active, with scores of escort and light carriers backing them. In total, the U.S. had built around 140 carriers of all types, an industrial feat unmatched in naval history. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Navy bluntly concluded that Japan had lost about 70% of its major warships. Even had Yamato survived, there would have been no fleet left for her to command. The contrast was stark. Japan clung to the vision of a decisive clash between great surface fleets, while America relied on production lines and coordination. Japanese planners believed individual ships could turn battles. The United States treated ships as replaceable units in a vast system of logistics, training, and air power. The irony was sharp. The nation that opened the Pacific War with a daring carrier strike at Pearl Harbor ended it with carriers all but extinct. Leyte's shadow extended far beyond 1944. In the months that followed, Japan would endure firebombing, kamikaze waves, and ultimately atomic devastation. Its navy, however, never recovered. Surviving veterans later returned not to sea, but to civilian life under occupation. At Yokosuka, a former destroyer officer found work repairing engines for the U.S. Navy. A bitter but necessary turn. He later recalled shaking hands with an American sailor, both men surprised at how ordinary the gesture felt after years of hatred. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison, chronicling the U.S. Navy's war, framed Leyte as both a triumph and a turning point. For him, it symbolized the end of Japan as a naval power and the solidification of American supremacy in the Pacific. Yet even he noted the human cost. Thousands of sailors on both sides lost in the churn of a battle that spanned hundreds of miles and 4 separate clashes. For those who had fought, the meaning was more intimate. Survivors remembered the sweetness of canned fruit in a hospital ward, or the sound of their comrades singing Kimegeo as ships rolled under. These memories, both bitter and tender, outlasted the statistics. The psychological arc closed with silence. What had begun in 1941 with thunderous surprise ended in 1944 with resignation. The empire that had set the Pacific aflame now looked back from ashes. Yet decades later, at reunions and museum decks, former enemies shook hands, trading cigarettes and stories instead of shells. In that act lay the long shadow of Leyte, remembrance, reconciliation, and the final acceptance that Japan's fleet and its doctrine of decisive battle had gone forever.